Hello, and welcome to Drake University's presentation of our paper, Endlessly Exhausting Possibilities, Pandemic Planning and Support Services. I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Today you'll hear from Greg Christie, the Assistant Director of Campus Relations in charge of campus technicians, Becky Klein, the Assistant Director of Campus Relations in charge of our support center and student technicians, Clayton Mitchell, our Assistant Director of Teaching and Learning in charge of Academic and Emerging Technology, and finally myself, Jerome Hilscher, the Associate Chief Information Technology Officer in charge of all of campus relations. When we decided we were going to do a paper on the pandemic and planning for support during a pandemic, we chose this image as our guiding light. I often reference the pandemic as 4.5 Mondays followed by a Friday afternoon, but if you are in support services, you know that our job changes on a regular basis. And that change is something that we all have to deal with. So when we start thinking of support during a pandemic, we are planning and hopeful that our business continuity plan laid out all the steps of what might be needed to support our university during a pandemic. I must say that my business continuity plan was incomplete, and essentially the pandemic piece discussed having a multi-stage plan to deal with a zombie uprising. It was not well written, and my supervisor was not impressed, and so we removed that. But the key piece was that I knew that as the pandemic began, I wanted to reevaluate what our plan was, and I wanted to have a multi-stage plan. Prior to the pandemic, as we were moving into this, I was going through a large leadership change with my team, and that change drove three things. It drove a regular reexamination of how I utilize my internal team, seeking feedback on the leadership of the team, and the willingness to change and adapt. Originally, my leadership team was everybody who reported directly to me. So whether they were an individual or contributor, or if they actually had individuals reporting to them, they were part of the leadership team. And I pared that down, and I sketched out with that group what our end user needs would be. More access to remote support. What are our students' needs, and what might those needs be? And that is the idea of laptops and network access, and how can we ensure that students are getting the best service possible? How do our student workers handle this? What are the needs of our staff and that work within ITS, that work on my team, and how do I keep all of us safe? The key for me was my pandemic plan was not going to be mine. It was going to be ours. This factor was important to me. I asked myself, if the worst thing happens and I get taken out by the virus, how can my leadership team carry on with functioning after what I can only assume would be a long and elaborate grieving process? And that to me was important. So the plan was multi-steps. It was 4 different stages, stage A through D, and it was 4 pages of well-documented, highly thought out information. And it lasted exactly 1 week. 1 week into the pandemic, we had gone from step A through to step D, and the severity had ratcheted up. This meant that we had to make sure that we were planning for adaptability, which we had discussed as we were putting the plan together. And by adaptability, that means just being able to roll with ongoing changes. And lastly, our plan has undergone continual review and continual communication. So after the leadership team discusses it and we come up with ideas and we seek outside input, we then meet regularly with the entire IT campus relations staff of roughly 20 individuals. Dare I say, it's unprecedented. On to you, Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg Christie. I'm the Assistant Director of Campus Relations for Drake University. I service the campus technician side. Rebuild after rebuild, etc. What do I mean by rebuild? Well, we've become accustomed to this. We've adapted to multiple changes over our period of time. Say, 3 years ago. We had a flood, took out our whole central hub. We had to move our operations everywhere with our techs separated out between colleges. The next year, we had a tragedy hit, and we lost a tech. Not only did we have to rebuild from ground up from the flood, but now we also had to rebuild for our morale. Now last year, the pandemic. This is where we had to rebuild via support and different constructs of how we gave them support. To remote or not to remote? That is the question that we will ask every day from now on. With the pandemic that hit us, we had to rebuild. We had to keep people. Do we keep people on campus or do we put them off? A lot of people chose to work off campus, and as well, we chose to put some of our techs off campus. Remoting wasn't a necessity with Drake University, since most of our work was done with either the small remote desktop operations, but most of the time we were doing it face-to-face, service with a smile. We also had to figure out what our obligation was to the user. Do my campus techs work with just our Drake issued equipment? Do we support personal equipment? And how far do we support ISP problems? We figured out a lot during that time, and a lot of that was helped to Beyond Trust, or some people known as BOMGAR. That system has supported us through the pandemic and has continued on. That is one piece of software that has saved us all last year and will continue to be used by Drake University for now until the near future. Our business is about technology. Yes, but it's also about operations and customer relationships. That quote has a little bit of ring with it, where everyone is in this mess together. Yes, we do offer support, but the problems will always be resolved. It's how everything was handled during the issue that makes or breaks a relationship. That is one thing that a lot of people talk about during this pandemic. It's not about the issue that the person's having. It's about how we handle the person. Everything we are doing is to create relationships to work easier to the future. And with that, I want to transfer over to Becky Klein, my peer and the other Assistant Director of Campus Relations.
I'm Becky Klein, Assistant Director of Campus Relations. I'm the manager of our student techs and the administrator of our Team Dynamics ITSM system. The biggest question we had was how to continue to provide campus-wide support in virtual fashion. Before the pandemic, we had basically 4 intake vectors, and the majority of our tickets came in via phone calls and walk-ins, which were primarily handled by our student techs. Our phones were not virtualized at that point, and it took us a few months to convert the phone lines and get them set up for our student techs to access. We had also intentionally not automated email intake in Team Dynamics when the system was implemented in the hopes of pushing people to the portal. However, users always found it a struggle to get there. They would say, too many options, it's hard to find the correct one, etc., etc. We looked at how to use our existing tools to best provide support to our users. We didn't want to just send everything to our after-hours support Black Belt help because of budgetary constraints. So at first, our campus techs answered all the incoming phone calls and did all the imaging, as well as working on resolving the tickets they were assigned. We hurriedly set up voicemail so that at least the students could handle incoming voicemail messages that the techs weren't able to answer. I advocated for implementing automated email intake since we knew that people were emailing our automated reply address anyway. My argument was that it would help with the campus perception of our responsiveness by helping us to catch messages that we previously weren't getting. We also worked on virtualizing our phones through Skype for Business, and that was in place by the early summer so that students could again start taking the incoming calls. Texts were still in the queue, but at least they weren't the primary responsibility. We would have liked to have a chatbot, but there wasn't budget money for that. One of the biggest challenges we've had from a technical perspective has been the variation among the equipment used by our staff. Our full-time campus techs have Drake-provided laptops, but all the student techs were using their own equipment, so lots of variation in operating system, settings, peripherals, etc., audio and video settings, especially how to make sure that both sides of calls were understood and heard clearly. Plus, we had to grapple with using dedicated apps versus using Citrix Receiver to virtualize some of those apps. And that continues to be a changing landscape even now. So not only were all the staff remote, but I've had to stay primarily remote due to my family's health needs. Thankfully, one change I had implemented before the pandemic was to use the Career Center's handshake system for recruiting and taking applications, and that has continued to work very well through this whole process. We've also embraced Microsoft Teams for our training and meetings and continue to do that. Right at the beginning of lockdown, I had to create an entirely new schedule for our student techs, and that included shift change meetings 3 times a day to cover common questions, the most recent operational changes, and so forth. And all of us on leadership took turns running those meetings. Then the schedule changed again in the summer due to having a smaller staff and a simpler schedule. I varied usage of the various communication channels based on the importance and urgency of the content. I also did one-on-one meetings each term with each of my student techs to check in with them, and it's about time for me to do another round of those here. Our operations have continued to evolve over the last year, so now we've got some staff back in person with protocols in place. This includes a combination of in-person and remote staff, both student and campus techs. We're managing traffic flow in the building, continuing to leverage digital resources to provide ongoing support to campus. We resumed having student techs do computer imaging in late June, so the techs don't have to worry about that. And then because ITS was one of the first Teams adopters, that helped us to support the rest of campus when we had our rapid pivot a year ago. Faculty and staff office phones were recently migrated to Microsoft Teams, and that includes the support center phones. And that process hasn't been free of issues, so we're still navigating the switch and figuring out how to best optimize that system. We've also onboarded a couple more departments to Team Dynamics, so that's a good sign that campus is trusting that particular tool and finds it valuable to use. Now I'm going to turn it over to Clayton.
Hello, my name is Clayton Mitchell. I'm the Assistant Director of Teaching and Learning at Drake University. I work with the Academic and Emerging Technology Center along with my colleagues, Carly Good, who's a Learning Management Specialist, Megan Flynn, who is the Campus Support Specialist, and James McNabb, who's the Multimedia Producer and Panopto Admin. So one of the challenges that we found heading into the pandemic is that with the rush to move all the classes online at a moment's notice, all the faculty, even the most reluctant, were now acutely aware of the LMS. However, those faculty who would ignore the LMS as something they didn't need to understand or use were forced to convert content to online delivery model, and our job was to help them make that conversion. So here was the problem. AET was tasked with helping campus prepare for a semester at distance, and the faculty had to move their content into their courses in a digestible and intuitive way. A significant number of faculty, if they'd used the LMS at all, had only used it as a file repository, and it was nearly impossible to navigate, much less to help the students actually be successful. Many faculty were not prepared to redesign their instruction for an asynchronous delivery model. They had expected to continue using a synchronous distance delivery model with tools that they've never used before. The tool that we had at the start of the pandemic was Blackboard Collaborate, and many of them struggled with using that. Additionally, faculty had to learn to create asynchronous video content and make it available in their courses if they weren't going to use a synchronous delivery model. They had to learn how to use our multimedia delivery system, Panopto. Again, this proved challenging for many faculty. But wait, there was more. So the pandemic hit just as we were concluding our evaluation and implementation of updating our LMS. So this caused a significant amount of confusion because not only did faculty think that they had to use an LMS, they now, a significant number of them thought that they may have to use the new LMS they'd never been trained on. In addition to that, the university had newly started our online degree programs, and their primary role was to support graduate students, not undergraduate students, although a number of the faculty and campus as a whole thought that since we had an online degree programs, that they would be a resource to help support them. And so that online degree program had to shift gears very quickly to help support undergraduate needs, which was never their intent. And then lastly, faculty were off contract for the summer, and so that coordinating with them was difficult. So, here was our planning for the fall. Basically what we heard from management. Hey, you need to get campus ready for a fall COVID semester. Okay, we can do that. But we're going to furlough a lot of staff. Okay, we understand. And all this needs to be dealt with on an ad hoc basis because everybody's off contract. Sweet. But there is good news. Both faculty and students were able to successfully adjust for the new reality caused by the pandemic. Yay! Faculty who were previously unconcerned with providing content via the LMS were now acutely aware why it was important. And lastly, most faculty have realized that they are responsible for the technology that they choose to use and that design impacts delivery either positively or negatively. So as with everything, this is an ongoing process that we're continuing to evolve and that we make changes as we go along. So when we started the pandemic, we only had Blackboard Collaborate. A lot of people struggled with that tool. The campus has since brought on Zoom as a collaboration tool, which brings its own challenges. But we are continuing to evolve and make changes in order to be successful to help campus in these trying times. Whew. I'm glad that's all over. The pandemic, that is.
Thank you, Clayton. In conclusion, you can see that restructuring the leadership team and reviewing how we were going to be IT leaders regardless of whether we were in a pandemic or not, factoring in the rebuilding of our campus technology team and our support center, we were able to easily plan for remote support and a return to campus. It was easy for us to keep in mind the idea of what our resources are and for us to be nimble enough to pivot and know when we had to change resources. By keeping the people aspect front and center in our planning, we always have focused on what is best, how can we do this most safely, and how can we provide the highest quality of service while not risking anybody's health and safety. On top of all of that, we planned for the pedagogical support of faculty members who were both highly technically adept and even those who were Luddites, and how to help every faculty member in between. And so many people are hoping that road straightens out and we get back to normal. Anybody who has done support for any length of time knows that there's going to be no return to anything normal. And we are all well aware that the pandemic, which when we first started planning was only going to last a semester, is going to drag on well into next fall. So thank you for attending our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed yourselves.